When we gardeners consider the prospect of pruning our trees, sometimes we're very fearful of it. We worry that we're going to wound the tree. Well, any sort of pruning actually does wound a tree, but trees have their own ways of healing over. And I want to give you some tips today on the proper cuts to make on trees and the proper time to do that so that they will heal over properly. Now up here against this pecan tree is an example of a bad pruning cut that was made a couple of years ago. And it has tried to heal over partially, but because the limb was not properly cut before the final cut was made, we have some rot setting in. If you look on down the tree, we have an area where a branch was taken out several years ago, and it's healed over. You can hardly even tell that the wound is there. And so I want to look at a few younger trees and some older trees today and give you tips that you might be able to adopt in your own garden, give you ideas on how to prune successfully. This grove of trees that you see was planted here 3 years ago on the north side of our barn to help screen the research greenhouses that are back behind us here. And we planted some native trees such as redbud, but also planted Chinese pistache, Japanese black pine, some lacebark elm, and also some loblolly pine to help fill in and also screen from noise and wind. But they need pruning. They haven't had much attention for 3 years because we normally don't shoot sessions of Oklahoma gardening here, and so they haven't had very much attention, but they do need some pruning up. Now this lacebark elm right here is right next to our driveway, and it's grown quite a bit in 3 years and is starting to get in the way when we drive in. When you think about pruning trees, you need to have an idea in mind of why you're going to prune. There are many reasons. You may have branches that are diseased or dead. You may have limbs that have been broken in a storm, or you may have limbs that have just outgrown the site. It's always a good idea, of course, to first select trees that are suited for the site size-wise, but sometimes they do overgrow the area and they need some pruning. Also, you may want to prune up limbs so that you can properly mow under and around trees. And when you're pruning trees, the best time of year to do it is usually in late winter. The worst time is when the leaves are just falling, and also when the leaves are just coming out in the spring. In the fall, when the leaves are just falling, the trees are trying to put out new feeder roots down under the soil. In the spring, when new leaves are coming out, a lot of the tree's energy is going into new foliage, but that foliage is not very productive yet in terms of producing sugars. So the ideal time is the late winter. The reason we want to talk to you about pruning right now is so that you won't do it at the wrong time, but so that you will be ready for it late this winter. Now in pruning trees, I mentioned that they have their own means of healing themselves. There's a structure on trees where the limb attaches to the main trunk, and this is called the branch collar. And the branch collar is the area that widens out as the limb attaches to the trunk. And under there are special plant cells that have a capacity to heal over if a tree is wounded. That's where you want to make your cuts. Now below here is an area where the tree naturally dropped a limb when this was in a nursery and it was shaded out, and it's healed over just right. Years ago, we used to tell gardeners to make what we called flush cuts, and that meant right straight against the trunk of the tree or the main limb you're cutting back to, and then cut it out and make it the shape of a football. Well, that left a very much larger wound than if you cut just ahead of the branch collar, and the tree had a lot more dead wood back in it that decayed as a consequence of that sort of cut. So right here, what we want to do is just take some loppers, and the best tools for limbs that are larger than a ½ inch in size are bypass type loppers. These are better than anvil type shears. Your blade, or the sharp part, needs to be right against the trunk, and the hook should be on the part that will be discarded. That way you'll have a good clean cut. Now where you want to cut is just ahead of the branch collar, but not so far ahead that you'll leave a stub that could invite decay. So we'll place it right about there, and we'll have to angle out some on this tree so that we will not cut into the limb above it. That left a little bit of a stub, but it's the best we could do considering the limb just above us. Now on around here, the smaller growth, I can just prune with some hand shears. Again, the bypass type are best. And also, remember to keep the blade, the cutting edge, right next to the part that will remain on the tree. This part right here I'll need loppers for, and then I'll finish cleaning up that cut. You can see by cutting just ahead of that collar, the diameter of my wound is much smaller than if I had tried to cut just flush with the trunk of the tree. Well, let's go look at the red buds. I'll give you some tips there on how to train those properly and avoid some weak wooded limbs in later years. Sometimes the decisions that we have to make when pruning trees are not very easy ones, and this redbud right here is a very good example. This tree was put in 3 years ago with a tree spade, and it's not had any pruning since then, but we have a bad problem starting here. And this is where a little education about how trees grow and training them early on can prevent problems later. We have a very weak, narrow crotch angle developing on this redbud right here. Another problem is that we have some dead wood where an old branch was broken off a couple of years ago. We've had some water sprouts come up since then, and so we just have a bad situation altogether here. Now, if you looked at the tree all over in general, you might say, well, if you cut away half the tree, you're going to ruin the shape. But young trees compensate for that later in their life. And overall, it's better to do some hard pruning early on rather than have to make big decisions later. When this tree gets bigger, a windstorm could cause it to split in half entirely, and we might lose the whole tree. So what I've decided to do is right along here, where we have what's called a bark ridge starting, I'm going to make a pruning cut sloping just like this. And I'll start cutting from the bottom up with my pruning saw and take this entire section away. That will heal over, and I should have a nice straight trunk tree that will eventually fill out on this side and give me a good shape and a healthy trunk at the same time. Now, you don't have as easy a marker on this as a branch collar. What you have are two co-existing limbs that are fighting each other in competition to make a main trunk. And really about your only line of reference is this bark ridge right here. So what I want to do is follow the angle of this little crevice right here. Starting from the bottom, I'll cut up and try to meet it right at that point. And right up in there, we do have some cells that will help wall off or compartmentalize the healthy parts of the tree from the remaining wound on the tree and help heal it off. There. Now this may look quite bare right now, but once this tree grows and the trunk begins to expand, we'll have a good, healthy, straight trunk on the redbud, let it branch out further up, and be a healthier tree overall. Now back here on this pine tree, we've got a couple more examples to show you. Now on pine trees, the branch collar, where the limb attaches to the main trunk, is usually not real obvious, and it's a little harder to spot. It's usually flatter against the trunk. So when our gardener Dennis did some pruning up here this summer so that he could mow, he left a little bit of a stub right here just ahead of the collar. And this part right here will probably die back, but I'm not going to cut into it anymore right now. But right here is where our branch collar actually is on the pine tree. Now when you're cutting branch collars, don't worry about the lumpy appearance it may have right now. As the tree grows, you won't even notice it later on. One other thing I want to point out on this Japanese black pine are these yellow needles. Our extension offices are getting a lot of calls right now about yellow needles on their pine trees. And the first question that we always ask is, where are the needles on the tree? Are they up on the tip of the growth, or are they back in the rear ends of the branches? If they're just these needles right here, this is just old growth. These are usually just 3-year-old pine needles that are falling. It is autumn and pines do shed needles every fall, and usually those are the 3-year-old needles. It's perfectly natural and nothing to worry about. Your tree does not have any disease. Now, if the tips of your pines do show signs of yellowing or discoloring of some kind, then you do have a problem on your pines. But these are nothing to worry about. Well, I have a row of soapberry trees that were pruned a year ago by one of the horticulture classes here at OSU, and I want to show you how those are healing up. Last fall, the ornamental horticulture classes here at OSU got out here and pruned these western soapberry trees. They took out some of the unnecessary limbs and they thinned every other tree so that the existing trees have plenty of space to grow. I want to show you how some of those pruning cuts they made have healed up. Here's an example of what we would call a flush cut. They didn't leave very much of the branch collar, and consequently it is not healed over as much as we would have liked for it to, and the center of the cut has started to crack and check a little bit, and that may be an opening for decay in the tree. Now up here we have a little better cut that was made, and this is what we like to see gardeners make. Leave a little of that bulge, that branch collar, cut just ahead of it, and see how much more it is healed over. And probably by next spring or maybe midsummer, it will be completely healed over and be far less detectable than the other wound. And at this point, I want to make one big point to you, and that's that you don't need to dress wounds after you prune a tree. A tree is not like a human being. It doesn't need a Band-Aid on it. The way trees heal themselves is they wall off the wounded area from within. And putting a wound dressing on there doesn't really help the tree at all. It's making the right cut in the right place. In fact, when trees have a branch that dies from disease or some other problem, it will wall off itself at that point and let the limb drop off naturally. And I have one like that I want to show to you right now. This soapberry tree ahead of me here has just had a branch die back this past year. And the tree, in preparing for itself, has already naturally walled off a place just ahead of the branch collar. If we pull this limb away, you can see that there's a little bit of a dead stub left, but there's also plenty of healthy, healing tissue cupping up around it to heal over that area. Now, a few last points on pruning trees. The best time to do it is in late winter, in the dormant season. First, remove your dead, damaged, and diseased wood, and then remove any limbs that are crossing each other. Last of all, don't put any wound dressings on the tree. And most importantly, think safety. If you feel uneasy about climbing into a tree to remove limbs, by all means hire a professional. Use the proper tools when you're pruning, and don't get into a tree and do any pruning when you're tired at the end of the day.